with the criminals in Trinidad and Tobago. We are under siege, and that is very clear. You know, today, whilst we were waiting for the Honourable Prime Minister and his team to join us to start the meeting, I think assured us maybe in 15 minutes. When I had got there, I had a murder rate of 308 persons. Stories carried in the media today. And within that 15 minutes, that short 15 minutes while we waited alone, I got calls that there were at least 3 other murders. So from 308, within 15 minutes, I was informed, another 311. So I'm saying we're under siege. And that is what prompted me to write the letter, that this is not something that the government can do alone or the opposition can do alone, although the Prime Minister has a different view in terms of accountability. But we can come to that later on. So it was in that spirit of joining forces in this war that we need to wage against the criminals in Trinidad and Tobago that I wrote the letter requesting a meeting with the Honourable Prime Minister and his team. And I would like to take a moment to thank the Honourable Prime Minister and his team for accommodating our request and meeting with us this morning. I would also like to thank the team, the members who accompanied me, Senator Wade Mark, Dr. Rudal Monilal, Senator Hadid, Senator Ramdeen, and Member of Parliament Ramona Ramdial. We met in caucus yesterday with other members of the opposition, and we came to a consensus as to our approach today in the meeting in terms of the matters that we would raise. So, as I repeat, our thanks to the Honourable Prime Minister for acceding to the request to meet with us. And we want to thank him and his team for what was a very cordial meeting where we were able to reach some grounds of understanding and to agree to work as we go forward and the way in which we would work as we go forward with respect to the fight against crime. And may I take an opportunity? I think there's a misnomer taking place. We're talking about crime talks. These were clearly anti-crime talks. So I want to get that very clear. Anti-crime talks and anti-crime initiatives that we feel that we could share with the government and, of course, work together with the government. So when we met, I said to the Honourable Prime Minister, apart from thanks and so on, look, how can we help as an opposition? Please share with us what we can do to assist as an opposition. So whilst the government may have its measures and its plans and initiatives, please share with us in what ways we can help. And the Honourable Prime Minister raised 3 matters that he thought that would be useful for getting assistance from the opposition, and I would return to those 3 matters. And then I indicated we had specific proposals we would like to share. I further indicated that these proposals were not the end-all and be-all of everything. I further indicated that the proposals would be those that would be for the short term, medium term, and long term. It cannot all be done in one shot, or it cannot all be done with any 1 or 2 or 3 measures. So it is in that spirit I ask you, as I speak to you now, and as I share the proposals that we shared with the government, to look at them in that regard, in the immediate short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. I suggested to the Honourable Prime Minister that there were several matters that could be considered low-hanging fruit, and which was really there for immediate plucking, low-hanging fruit. And with respect to low-hanging fruit, there were several matters which really related to the repeated initiatives that the Honourable Prime Minister had shared with the country, first in the 10-point plan, then in the manifesto last year, and more recently were repeated in the budget statement of the Honourable Minister of Finance. And amongst these that I termed low-hanging fruit, one of these was the promise of the government to establish a joint border protection agency to manage the security and integrity of our very porous borders. In fact, I think the manifesto of the government, well, prior to coming to government, had talked about our porous borders are a major source of proliferation of illegal guns and drugs, which are primary drivers of crime in Trinidad and Tobago. And to address this threat, the government's initiative, then in opposition, and again repeated in government, was for the establishment of a joint border protection agency. And we said to the government, look, this is low-hanging fruit. This has been repeated, 10-point plan, manifesto, and in budget statement of almost a year ago. And this is something, can we help? And we asked government to consider, respect to the status and for expediting implementation, because we do believe it is a measure that can assist us, given that the majority of the crime is through illicit guns, illicit drugs coming into our country. We don't produce guns. We don't produce 99% of the drugs, the trafficking takes place and so on. And so the issue of closing the borders, we had tried in our own way, but I'm not going backwards in terms of what we did or didn't do at this point in time. There has been time for that, and there will be other times. We're talking of the way forward. So that was one thing we saw as low-hanging fruit, in which we will added them with the government. We agreed with the government, and we would assist in any way we can. The second had to do with municipal police officers. Again, in its then 10-point plan, in opposition, point 3 of that 10-point plan indicated that should they come into government, they would activate the laws necessary to establish police units in all 14 local government bodies and the THA. Again, this was repeated in the Manifesto 2015 and in the statement of the Honourable Minister of Finance in Parliament in the budget debate. This is another approach that we felt that would have a value because it would help policing at the community levels and assist with whatever you have in the manpower in the police force, defense force. That the municipal policing was a good initiative, and again, we asked government what was the status of this, because we've been told about it for some time, and indicated our support for such a measure. Together with that, we pointed out the plight of the municipal officers, which follows upon a judgment that was given by the Privy Council in the case known as Allen and the Attorney General. And in that case, the Privy Council delivered a decision in which, in the case in which the municipal officers were complaining that they were being treated unequally and receiving different terms and conditions from regular police officers, even though they were required to do the same work. So we reminded the Honourable Prime Minister and his team of this decision, because if it is that the government intends to proceed with its plan with respect to municipal officers, which we think is a good plan, which we will support, then we would have to come to terms with the findings of the Privy Council. The Privy Council upheld the challenge of the municipal police officers, and they made a declaration that they were unequally treated in breach of their rights under Section 4D of the Constitution. However, since the making of that order by the Privy Council, the police officers are still awaiting to be paid their damages for breach of their rights, and of course for those officers to be regularized in keeping with regular police officers. So I drew this to the attention of the Honourable Prime Minister and the Attorney General, and again, they undertook to look into these. In fact, all of these matters we raised, I can come at the end, but I may say they agreed that these matters would be considered. In addition to those which were initiatives that the government, when in opposition, and again when it came into government, repeated as initiatives, we said we were willing to give support. Further low-hanging fruit that we reminded the government of, and we felt that could be done almost immediately, but most certainly in the short term, and which would have a tremendous impact on the fight against crime, was for implementation of crime legislation that is already in our statute books, but have not been operationalized, not implemented. And we believe those are important because you will not have to go through the long drafting process, the cabinet approval, parliamentary sittings, and so on. They took a long time. One of them took us 5 years to do. And that one that I pointed out to the government has to do with the procurement legislation. You will recall, in our 5 years, it took us 5 years. We started almost immediately we went into government. I had promised before that election to lay the proposal papers and policy papers in the parliament, and we established a joint select committee. We went through almost to the end of the 5-year term. We passed the legislation. The new government came into being and indicated they wanted to amend it. Those amendments have been made, and they have been passed in the parliament with the support of both benches, government and opposition. But to date, it has not been proclaimed. And so we ask government to consider, at the earliest, low-hanging fruit sitting there that will help in the fight against white-collar crime. We talk about corruption and fraud all the time. Here is a piece of legislation. Now it is no longer just legislation, because you say we are talking only about legislation. It is on the statute books, so it is legislation. But what has to happen to operationalize it will be all the administrative measures to be put into place to appoint the various bodies which were created by the procurement legislation. And so that is another low-hanging fruit, which I think can be, well, we will say picked or plucked, as the case may be, at the earliest opportunity. The second piece of legislation is the DNA Act. In every developed country in the world, DNA plays a very important role in the detection of crime. And that is tied in, of course, with forensics and so on. So we already have on our statute books passed when we were in government, already there, supported by the opposition then, so that is a bipartisan measure. DNA Act 5 of 2012, waiting really to be utilized. And so we ask the government again to give attention to it at the earliest opportunity. One of the main problems we experience in the fight against crime has to do with the issue of detection. We know that detection rates are very low. But this piece of legislation would assist us in improving the detection rate. That act, as I said, was passed unanimously by the then opposition and the then government. The act strengthened and expanded the framework within which intimate and non-intimate samples could be taken for forensic DNA analysis. The legislation provided for taking of samples without consent from a suspect, from a detainee, accused, or a convicted person. And it specified the conditions under which such samples could be taken. And some of the very important, significant features which I reminded us of this morning had to do with the establishment of a national forensic DNA data bank, appointment of a custodian, deputy custodian, who shall be responsible for receiving and storing all DNA profiles in the forensic DNA data bank, and establishment of and maintenance of a DNA register. So these pieces of legislation I see as low-hanging fruit for implementation, and that is also tied in the fight against crime with other pieces of legislation. One of them is the Electronic Monitoring Act number 11 of 2012. That piece of legislation on our statute books, passed again in a bipartisan manner, can go a very long way in transforming and modernizing the criminal justice landscape and help unlocking the overcrowding at the prisons, so helping at the prisons, dealing with the issue of repeat offenders, the revolving door syndrome. It is aimed to see the criminal justice system better equipped to strengthen our law enforcement measures. And it's sought to make provision for introducing electronic monitoring at different stages of the criminal justice process, as well as to make it a condition of a protection order granted under the Section 5 of the Domestic Violence Act. It establishes an electronic monitoring unit mandated with the duty to implement a system of electronic monitoring. By this piece of legislation, law enforcement can be given the ability to monitor those persons who have displayed socially disruptive behavior, but outside of the prisons. Again, as I say, freeing up costs and space and time. It was also a means by which persons who are on remand could have secured liberty pending trial. And we asked the government again to give serious consideration to expedited implementation of the Electronic Monitoring Act. The other one we raised was the controversial Administration of Justice Indictable Proceedings Act 20 of 2011. That was the one with the infamous Section 34, but that Section 34 has been removed. It is not there, it was repealed. And this is a piece of legislation that receives support from all sides. Throughout all the various processes, it received support, government, independent, opposition. And this is really with the aim for doing away with preliminary inquiries, thereby hastening the criminal justice system, expediting trials and so on. People waiting 15 years and 20 years, 19 years. Justice delayed is justice denied. So again, we ask government to have a look at this again with a view as a low-hanging fruit to expedite. These were some of the measures that we felt could be tackled early o'clock in the short term. I made a point, and we had put 5 points on our legislative on the agenda in terms of the letter that we passed to the Honorable Prime Minister. Legislative, non-legislative, administrative, and others, and further collaboration down the road. So we repeated those things. And government's response really was that the matters we had raised were in progress, that they were in progress. So really the ball is back in the court of the government. We are willing to assist with respect to these areas of low-hanging fruit for early implementation to help us in the fight against crime. Joint border patrols being worked on, we were told, municipal police in advanced stage, procurement legislation, proclamation implementation that is coming. We mentioned a forensics science center to be modernized, that is coming. Electronic monitoring, very close to being operationalized. So that was heartening to hear the government say that these matters were in progress and should come to us at an early opportunity, with legislation already on the books, and with initiatives that did not require legislation. I mentioned before, the border patrols, the municipal police, and so on. We further raised matters in the fight against crime, which we felt could be of immediate impact and effect. That is, we asked the government to consider putting more boots on the ground. More boots on the ground. That is to say, more officers out there, so that we have that comfort zone. We get that sense of safety, security, and comfort when we see law enforcement officers out there. I know during our time there was the interagency task force, which was the joint patrols, police and army. We have no problems with that. It is happening, but we feel that more of this needs to be done at this point in time, given where we are with the upsurge in the crime. We were worried, as everyone else is, with respect to terrorism and the fight against terrorists. And so we suggested the establishment of a counter-terrorism center to the government. And of course, we await their word on that. We raised the issue of the prison rules. Now, you may or may not know that at this point in time, Trinidad and Tobago is operating on prison rules that were made under 1838 legislation. Believe it or not, 1838 legislation. And so we indicated to the Honorable Prime Minister that we need to get these prison rules amended at the earliest opportunity. We indicated that we had worked with stakeholders whilst we were in government. We amended the prison rules, and all that needs to be done now, all that needs to be done is for it to be laid in Parliament. So we called on government, if they want to amend it even further, but to do it quickly, because that too will help us with all the problems we're having in the prison system. So prison rules was another item that we raised with the government. We raised the issue of hanging, because whilst it is the government now and the opposition now, them and us as it were, and whilst it is when we were in government, them and us and them, we both on each side agree on hanging, on capital punishment for murder. So we asked the government to consider two things with respect to hanging: the categorization of murders, various categories. We had brought a bill to that effect in Parliament, but we had tied that bill together with enforcing capital punishment. It came to be known as the hanging bill. And because both pieces were tied in one bill, the then opposition did not support it, but they supported in principle hangings. So we indicated to the Prime Minister and his team, this is another area in which government can move expeditiously. The Honourable Prime Minister shared his view that they had received opinion that were we to change the law with respect to hanging, that we would move the law outside of what is known as the Savings Clause in the Constitution, and therefore, by doing that, we would remove the protection that is given by the Savings Clause, that even though the death penalty may be unconstitutional, it is saved nonetheless by virtue of the Savings Law Clause. That was the Prime Minister's view. He said, based on advice received. And I then asked him, well, Honourable Prime Minister, if that is your position, that there is no need to change the law, would you kindly let us know what steps are being taken for implementation? The Honourable Prime Minister again repeated the advice. I don't think we got a definitive statement, but I'm sure in the ongoing talks we would hope that we would get some kind of statement. But up to this point in time, we are not aware of any steps that are being taken in the absence of any law, and the view of the government that law is not necessary to be changed. What are the steps being taken for implementation of the death penalty? So those were some of the areas. We mentioned the social dimension to crime with respect to that inverse effect where the cutting of the social safety net results in an increase in crime, and that governments recommended that government would want to look very closely where you have the cuts in the social safety net in terms of food cards and baby grants and books, buying books for children and all the other things that are in the social safety net, that government would want to look a little more carefully, together with the job losses and so on, look more carefully, because these are some of the factors which could lead to crime. I'm not saying necessarily would lead to crime, but could lead to crime, and the government well listened, and I'm sure they would consider it in due course. So these were some of the areas, and I said the Prime Minister raised three issues when I asked him what way can we help in the fight against crime. One was with respect to the appointment of a police commissioner, or commissioner of police, appointment of commissioner of police. And tied up with that was the whole management of the police service. And the Prime Minister indicated, and I was surprised really, because I was taken aback when the Prime Minister indicated that, really, I wouldn't say indicated, I could hear in his remarks his frustration with respect to what was happening in the public service with respect to the appointment of a commissioner of police. And I reminded Prime Minister we had challenged a part of the order that was brought by the government for appointment of commissioner of police. The court had struck down parts of the order as being unconstitutional, but the rest of it remained. And I indicated to Prime Minister we were of the view that that was proceeding along what was in the order. And as I said, I was taken aback, when the Prime Minister expressed frustration at the fact that the public service was having tremendous difficulty in implementing the order and in getting the appointment of a commissioner off the ground. Prime Minister told us that he's struggling with that, and I mean, this was the order that the government brought because they thought it was important to have a commissioner of police, and Prime Minister voiced it again. We hadn't had a commissioner of police appointed for so many years. So we were a bit taken aback by the delays and the obstacles with respect to the appointment, but I'm sure the Prime Minister is in charge and that he would take the steps necessary to get this done, because the government obviously feels this is very important. The Prime Minister also raised the issue of the management of the police service and clearly expressed the view with some frustration that the police service is not equipped nor resourced to fight crime. And therefore, Prime Minister, having acknowledged that, we are of the view that the Prime Minister and the government would take the steps necessary for trying to deal with the issue of better resourcing of the police service and, of course, management of the police service. So that was one area, the management of police service, commission of police. The second area the Honourable Prime Minister raised was with respect to the SSA bill. And the fact that the opposition had not supported the SSA bill. I reminded the Honourable Prime Minister that even though the opposition had not supported that bill was passed in the Parliament, but the problem with it is it has not yet been proclaimed. So the Prime Minister may want to consider if the government thinks it is vital, because he did say intelligence gathering is very important in the fight against crime, and therefore that SSA bill. So really our help in that regard with the SSA bill is not requisite at this time, because it's already passed, waiting. Last time I checked, and I said it today, and that was not, nobody said it was not the case, that it has not been proclaimed up to date. So, and the third issue the Honourable Prime Minister raised when we asked, what help can we give, was the anti-gang legislation. And with respect to the anti-gang legislation, I reminded the Honourable Prime Minister that when it was brought to Parliament, 5 pieces of legislation, these were the sunset clauses, 5 pieces of legislation were brought in one bill. So we never had the opportunity to deal with them, each piece of law, and to go into the merits and demerits of each. They came in one block. I reminded our Prime Minister we had asked for a meeting to discuss it, and of course that meeting at that time was not forthcoming. And I further reminded our Prime Minister, which I'm sure he knows and the Attorney General knows, that that piece of law was deficient and defective, because we've seen persons who were arrested under the anti-gang law have gone free, not because of sunset clause or no sunset clause, but because the law was deficient and therefore the law needed amendments. We did give the undertaking, should the government want to bring the legislation, we will be prepared to look at it once it is within reason and, of course, constitutional bounds and so on. We would be prepared to support, because we do understand a lot of the crime also coming out of gangs. So we have given an undertaking to support new anti-gang legislation. So those were the 3 issues I think the Honourable Prime Minister asked for our help in, and I think I've explained those 3. I don't know if there's anything else. Team? Sure. Yes, something very important arose here. Very important. I want to thank the Honourable Prime Minister for readily agreeing to our proposal that the Parliamentary Committee on National Security be chaired by an independent and not by a government minister. So in effect, the Prime Minister agreed, and the minister who was the chairman for that parliamentary committee is to be removed. I think it is Minister Fitzgerald Hines. And that committee will then be chaired by an independent, which should be, well, Senate, of course. You only have independents in the Senate. So that was something we thought was very important, because we have a problem with many of these parliamentary committees being chaired by a government minister, because then, in our view, respectfully, it becomes as part of the executive rather than the legislature. So that is an important, I think, result, I would say, of our meeting today, that the Prime Minister agreed to that request that we made. We further asked the Prime Minister for this National Security Council, this Parliamentary Council Committee on National Security, that they would want them to meet more regularly. Because as it is now, it's a very good idea to have the committee, but then it doesn't meet. If it met 3 times in the past year or 4, that would be plenty. But if it is to really serve its purpose, we suggested, Honourable Prime Minister, look, this needs to meet more often. And then what we can do, all these things we want to meet you every day and talk to you about and discuss, they can go through the parliamentary committee, where we will have the benefit of the government, of the opposition, and the independents. So that when you actually come into the parliament to debate something or to talk about it, you would have gone through a lot of the acrimony would have been taken out of it, and we would have more consensus building at the end of the day, thereby saving, of course, more parliamentary time to do more work, other kinds of work. So I think that was a great benefit coming out of the meeting. And I trust that many of these matters, the Honourable Prime Minister suggested that they be funneled through that committee, the parliamentary committee. Again, in terms of time frame, we will have, the ball is in the court of the government as to when these things will be activated, when such committee meetings will take place, and what will go before the committees. So these are some of the matters. Of course, we had other matters. I indicated to the Honourable Prime Minister we will pass him, probably put these points in writing and send it on so that when they are considering the way forward and what should come to the committee at some future point, that parliamentary committee, they would have our ideas there. The Honourable Attorney General passed us a list of 13 pieces of proposed legislation. Well, we look forward to them. Good pieces of legislation. In fact, covered many of the things we had raised. He gave it to us almost at the end, but we were very happy to know, yes, we were very happy to note that many of the things in this list contained matters we had raised. So we look forward to those bills coming for us, bills or proposals coming, so we could have that bipartisan approach as we proceed forward. Yes, I'm being reminded about resources. The Honourable Prime Minister did indicate he would resource the committee, the parliamentary committee, and of course the Office of the Leader of the Opposition for this increased workload in terms of doing a lot of the work of the Committee on National Security, the Joint Select Committee on National Security. So those are our points, and just if I were to say just one more, the Honourable Prime Minister made a very important point when he said, crime fighting will always be a political issue, and I'm quoting what basically were his words from our notes. Crime fighting, the Prime Minister said, will always be a political issue. Government will always be held accountable for crime, and if a government cannot solve crime, it should be put out of office. The words of the Honourable Prime Minister. And his view, it is a political issue. I see many of the reports it should not be a political issue, but the Prime Minister has taken clear ownership of it and the government's response. So as I close, I want to again thank the Honourable Prime Minister and his team for meeting with us today. I think we have covered some ground, but really we will have to await to see the time frame and the timetable that the government puts out as we go forward in the fight against crime. There are many other areas and many other issues, I'm sure, that will be given due consideration. So thank you all very much, and we are open for questions.
Mr. Persad-Bissessar, following this meeting, were there any discussions about any follow-up meeting with the Prime Minister?
In terms of follow-up meetings, I think the Prime Minister has indicated that Parliament. I know we are meeting on Friday. We are meeting on the 9th. I did ask what would be on the order, what matter will be for debate, and the Attorney General indicated there are several matters already on the order paper, but they probably would indicate to us at the start of the week for matters that are already on the order paper. He did not indicate if they'll be bringing anything else, nor specify what we would be doing. But from what transpired, it is the government has taken the position that we will take all these proposals to the committee, and the government will put their crime-fighting proposals, incorporating these, before that Joint Select Parliamentary Committee.
There were a number of issues highlighted on both sides in this conference and in the media briefing before with Dr. Rowley, and there was no time frame given. Like you said, the ball is now in the courts of government. But are there any of these things that were discussed? Do you think any of them can be implemented in a short term?
Boots on the ground, more boots on the ground. That could happen as tomorrow. I was once there, been there, as they say, I've been there, done that. When we had really spikes, we called in the army, we called in the police officers and so on, the interagency task force, and we spoke with them, more boots on the ground. I think that could happen very quickly, very, very, very quickly. That is one matter. Yes, sir?
Dr. Rowley, in his press conference after the meeting, called on a better relationship in the parliament between the government and the opposition.
Sure.
In order not only for crime, but for other things to work. He says that is needed just to make sure that this meeting isn't another talk show. How does the opposition respond to it when it comes to the relationship with the government and still performing your role as an opposition?
I don't think that is impossible. It has happened before and it can happen again. We will stand firm where we believe it is necessary, where we see rights are being breached, where we see people are being trampled upon, or where we see measures that are not to the benefit or in the general public interest. We will speak out on those. I do not think that will preclude having a working relationship with the government so that they can do their job and we can do our job. It is their duty to bring matters to the fore and to the forefront, and it is our duty to work alongside them, to raise issues where they are, and I think that is what a good relationship would be. We had and I really don't want to go back. I told the Prime Minister today, I said, let's turn the page. Okay, here I am, I wrote everything you've said, we've talked about what happened in the past, let's turn the page, and let's get a new page. So I don't want to go backwards in that regard, but if it is that we use this parliamentary committee system, we can get rid of some of that acrimony so that when we bring suggestions, take the SSA for example, we had numerous amendments. Not one was considered, but that's going back. So hopefully we will not see that kind of behavior. Everything we say is not gospel truth, and everything they say is not gospel truth. So there must be a meeting of the minds, and I'm really optimistic. I think Dr. Rowley used that word himself too. But I'm very hopeful. I would put it not just optimism, but I am hopeful. We went there in good faith to put our ideas. There were many who felt this thing was a political ramage, and we're going there to score points. I don't want to score points because I cannot live in this country and see children being gunned down on the streets and feel comfortable and happy and political and ramage. When we're on the platform, we'll deal with platform. But I think in terms of working together, I mentioned to you about Churchill at the start. I'm a great student of history. I love history. And many of the movies I watch, documentaries, history. And Churchill, when there was war in the land, they came together. And we are at war. We are at war with the criminals. So in good faith, we went. Many people send me texts and email, what you going and meet that man for? And that's not the approach. And your question is a very good one, sir, as to whether we could have a working relationship. So a good relationship doesn't necessarily mean I agree with everything you say, nor do I agree with everything I say, but that we could have a meeting of minds and find some common ground as we go forward. A good working relation.
Just to write up the question of my colleague, how would you describe then the current relationship between opposition and government?
I do believe that there has been, on both sides perhaps, but certainly very early o'clock in the parliament sitting, and again, I didn't want to go backward, but very early o'clock we had the attitude, I'm in charge now. We are in charge now. Shut up. Sit down. That was the attitude. I mean, anybody watching the Parliament channel, if you're being truthful and realistic, that was the attitude. I talk about the SSA, the amount of amendments we had brought. In other areas, we proposed amendments. Nothing was being considered. Look, even that Commissioner of Police order. We pointed that out. We were at pains to point it out. And weeks before we even had the debate in the Parliament, that was unconstitutional. Well, we had, fortunately, the judiciary is really the guardian. The Supreme Court is the guardian of the Constitution, and they were able to rule it is unconstitutional, delayed it to take it forward, So if it is, the government has indicated, and we are indicating, we are willing to meet halfway. There must be a mutual respect for different views. I make the point again, you don't have to agree with everything. We don't have to agree with everything, but we could have that meeting of minds to prevent that kind of attitude, preventing the good working relation. Now you will say that doesn't tie in with the politics. How are you going to win an election if you batter up each other? I think we can win an election without battering each other or trying to kill each other. I honestly believe that. We share the views, you take it, you leave it. Would have done my duty to country and to my conscience.
public education and incorporating faith-based organizations and NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
We do have those issues, stakeholder consultations, NGOs, CBOs, FBOs, and so on, faith-based. We did have it on our listing, but you would realize that there was a time constraint, and I did indicate to Prime Minister we were leaving. Look, what we've discussed with you and the other things we have, we would share with you and send forward. Prime Minister said, look, there's a parliamentary committee, so you can raise these matters in the parliamentary committee. So we didn't know there was a time constraint. It's only when I read the newspaper this morning, I read that we were invited to be there at 11, and that the Prime Minister will be speaking to the media at 12. So I realized we had that window of, a 1-hour meeting. So we couldn't put the world in there, with due respect. So have a great day. If there are no more questions. Sure. Yes.
On a side note, right? What do you make of Mr. Allen's departure from Census 3?
What do I make of?
Mr. Allen's departure from Census 3.
I'm still not hearing.
Mr. Allen's departure from Census 3. What do you make of it? You think he was silent in the form from being muzzled?
That is for another day, another place, and another time. Yes.
Well, would you say the current crime situation in the country is based on the country financial state right now? Would you say that they are a major part?
No. No, I do not think what is happening is a direct result of the economic situation in Trinidad and Tobago, because if you look at the crime stats, you would see that we have had spikes in past times. So it's not simply, to say, well, directly is because we don't have money, this is a problem. No. I do not believe it is because of that. I could spend a moment with you if you like, the causes of crime. But remember, in the fight against crime, and related to your question at the back, if we take a holistic approach, you have matters dealing with prevention, detection, conviction, and rehabilitation. And our proposals were related to that. So don't walk away thinking they're only legislative matters that are of the utmost importance. Legislation alone cannot ever solve the problem. So, sir, young man, no. It is not because of the economy that crime is spiking.